Hi everyone, I'm Amee Parekh, founder and CEO of Stello AI. Stello AI is an AI-powered compensation planning platform designed to help you retain your top talent. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Allan Brown as our guest speaker on our series Stello Studios. Allan Brown is the former head of Total Rewards for Electronic Arts, Yahoo, and Citrix Systems, some of the world's best companies. He was also the first director of compensation at Google and built the first people analytics team at Microsoft. In short, Allan has experience building compensation structures for many cutting edge technology companies in Silicon Valley, especially during periods of high change. Allan is also a dear friend and colleague. Allan, welcome today to Stello Studios. This is our video series where we talk about compensation, total rewards, and all things to retain top talent. We are thrilled to welcome you and excited to talk about our topic on executive compensation.
Sure. Thanks, Ami. It's very nice to be here.
What is executive compensation? How is it different than employee compensation? Makes sense. Makes sense, Allan. You're sharing how it's really important to tie executive compensation with some long-term plans for the company, align it really well with the business strategy.
That's
That makes
right.
sense.
And
Um,
one last thing is that every year for public companies, the shareholders get an opportunity to vote on whether they support or don't support executive compensation. And so they'll look at all of the details, and then they'll say they either approve it or they don't. And that's something called say on pay. It's a say on pay vote that every public company goes through. So that's that extra scrutiny. It's actually pretty similar. I mean, CEOs also earn base salaries. They get bonuses. The big difference is on the equity. I mean, people will, workforce employees and other executives below the CEO will also get forms of stock-based compensation. But for CEOs and the executives that are publicly reported with the SEC, they're scrutinized more by shareholders, and all of the details of those programs are usually reported. So that increased level of scrutiny is a big deal for the executives and for shareholders, and it's one of the main ways that they communicate about performance. The big thing too is that the equity for CEOs and much of their staff usually includes performance measures. So stock options don't have a performance measure other than, it's a specific strike price.
right.
But for the CEO and other, named executives, that means executives that are named in the proxy statements for the company, they usually have executive long-term incentive programs that are stock-based, that have performance measures that are aligned with the interests of shareholders. So, and so pay for performance is a huge thing for executives.
Allan, you referenced this a couple of times, so let's do a deep dive on this topic. You mentioned that the role of exec comp has really evolved in today's business environment, especially with increased scrutiny from shareholders and public. Can you tell us a bit more about that and, maybe even share any stories or examples that you might have seen in real life? How does this actually play out?
Sure, sure. I mean, people read about executive pay in the media all the time.
Right.
They will, see the top, 10 or top 100 CEOs and how much they're making. And some people may even think, well, oh, this person's making $50 million a year or $50 million base salary.
Right.
It's really the attention is mostly on the equity. So CEOs have a lot of pay at risk. So both the equity, I mean, if it's stock options and the stock doesn't go up, well, they don't make any money on that equity. It's a big part of their compensation. But even with bonuses as well, if those are tied to measures that actually matter to shareholders, and if the stock doesn't do well, if the company's not doing well, then the CEO wouldn't get paid as well. So that's a big deal, and I mean it's part of how executive pay has evolved because as that level of scrutiny by shareholders has increased, they're looking for many different ways to sort of pull levers to influence what happens in the business. The say on pay vote, while it's important, it's non-binding. Now, what
Uh,
that means is that they'll vote on it, but the company doesn't have to change anything.
right.
It just puts a lot of external pressure on it. And in the worst case scenario, if many of the shareholders are voting against executive pay, then there are these activist groups and other shareholder rights groups like ISS and Glass Lewis, who advise companies on how to vote on a range of topics for public companies. They may say, well, if the shareholders are voting against executive pay, they may start pointing toward the board members and saying, we recommend that you don't vote for these particular board members. And it's usually the board members that are on the compensation committee. So
That's
that's the kind of pressure that can be brought to the board when executive pay isn't sort of falling in line or is not aligned with the shareholders' interests.
that's fascinating, Alan. Is this a hot topic, executive compensation? Is this a hot topic only in the United States, or do you see this as a very hot and debated topic across the globe?
Yeah, it's debated more in the U.S. Because U.S. executives make a lot more than they do in other countries, and there's something called a CEO pay ratio
I
that
see.
came out over the last decade or so that looks at a CEO's pay compared to the average or actually the median employee. So the average employee, they divide, the that average employee into the executive's pay. This is everything, base, bonuses,
Yeah.
stock, and they come up with this ratio. Well, the ratio of executive pay to the average employee in the US is very high compared to most other countries. And,
Can you give us
it's
an example?
partly, I'm
What does
sorry.
it mean? Can you give us an example? What does high mean?
Well, so I'd say probably for the S&P 500, it's going to be somewhere, between 200 and 300. I don't have
Yes.
off the top of my head what it is, what the
I
average is
had
right
1 is
now.
to 150, but you might be right, Alan. It might be 200, 300.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
I
and
had
so
read.
it's like an acceptable level now. But if you look at other CEOs internationally, you're going to see much smaller ratios, and it's partly because options aren't as popular in some of those other countries. Some of the cultures
Yes.
that you find in other countries are not as focused on
Yeah.
monetary gains and rewards. I mean, other things are valuable.
Right. Right.
Like, I mean, I'll give you a quick example. I mean, in Japan, there's this word called ikigai,
I see.
and it's all about sort of the well-being you have in life and feeling good about your life and the way that your value in the world and things like that. It's really not, there's not a focus on money, but
And Alan, you mentioned something very interesting earlier, which is, the compensation committee. Can you tell us more? What is a compensation committee? What is its purpose? And
sure,
how
for
does it
sure.
impact, pay or exec pay or all employees' pay?
Sure. So for public companies, they have a number of committees. I mean, the standard ones are compensation. There's usually a governance committee, and there is typically an audit committee. Those are the three most common. There are some other ones that get created by different companies for different reasons, but a compensation committee is responsible for overseeing compensation for executives and often built into a charter, which is publicly available for any company. You can go find the compensation committee charter. They'll usually have oversight for all of compensation and benefits, but they're most focused on executive pay,
I
and
see.
even more distinctly for the named officers, which, as I mentioned before,
Yes.
those are the officers that have all of their pay just laid out in the proxy statement
Yeah.
each year.
Makes
So
sense.
compensation committee, I mean, what they're responsible for is the they are representing shareholders, and they want to make sure that the managers of the company are being paid appropriately for the performance that they're driving, in the company, and that's largely stock price.
Correct.
So shareholders get a return on their investments by the stock going up. If the stock is flat over a period of years and they're not making any returns on their investment, yeah, that's a problem. And they'd like to see executives in those cases paid less. In other cases, paid, if they're delivering, incredible returns, they're probably not going to complain about a high paycheck for a CEO.
I'm asking that if somebody is trying to set up exec comp, what should they be thinking about?
I see. Okay.
Connect it something
So
the long term or yeah.
yeah, so I mean, the first thing that should be done is to create a general pay philosophy. What's the purpose of compensation? Is it simply to be competitive with other companies? Is it do the incentives, are they driving specific behaviors or specific outcomes they think are most important for that particular company? I mean, there's just, in the incentive space, there are thousands and thousands of different measures that might be important, and choosing the right measures to incent executives is important, because people pay attention to their ability to create wealth through their work. So setting up companies, the executive pay piece of it, if it's a private company who's thinking about going public, they're going to think about setting up a compensation committee. They would develop a charter. They're probably going to hire an outside person who is a compensation consultant that would report into the board and try to help the board protect shareholders' interests. That kind of person has done a lot of the work. So I'm sure there are templates for things like charters, starting pay philosophies, and ultimately, then assuming that you've got some board members, you want people on the compensation committee that are going to work closely with the CEO to develop, and oversee how compensation is created for the executives in the company. So that's kind of the starting point. I mean, there's a lot involved.
Yes, yes. But this is super helpful, Alan. This is fascinating and really helpful insights for all of our audience.
Sure.
Alan, and I understand you're writing a book to be released, in the next couple of years on the
Yes.
topic of executive compensation. Talk to us more, on the vision on your book and what are you trying to like convey through this?
Sure. So yeah, it's a fascinating thing to write a book. It's very hard, but what I'm trying to do, if I were to summarize my thesis, it's that to some extent, executive pay has been a bit of a driver of wealth inequality in the United States.
Okay.
And I mean, this is a touchy subject. I mean, I've helped many companies develop compensation packages, and to the extent that that executive pay is a problem or an issue in the
Right.
U.S., well, I've helped drive that.
Correct.
So there's sort of there are two, so I'm complicit, but there are two sides of it. There's sort of there's the executive perspective, there are shareholders' perspectives. I'm hoping to illuminate some of the things about executive pay that people don't see. So it's a bit of an insider's view on executive pay. I mean, I've worked with a number of pretty high profile CEOs and have been privy to some interesting conversations inside the boardroom. People wonder what goes on behind those closed doors. Most of it is actually, I think people would find it boring. But
Yes.
occasionally,
Going through
when
properties, they're voting on it, they're making
things,
vote.
yes, and
Quarterly documents have shown
that's
up.
right, where they have to vote on it, or when, parts of the board disagree with other parts of the board, or if the board disagrees with the CEO, and those make for really interesting discussions. And I mean, part of the reason I got into executive pay was that it just felt like it was sort of connected to the heart of a company. Some people might say the brain of a company, but it's just at the core of the company because they're talking about, how the company's operating, and they're trying to appropriately reward the people that are making the strategic decisions, driving, the operations of the company. So just kind of fascinating. And, this issue of wealth inequality, it's a relevant topic today. People, I mean, throughout history, when wealth inequality becomes so stretched, it creates issues that disturb the social fabric of the country. And so I'm sort of interested in delving into some of that because a lot has happened over the past 5 years. Don't need to go into it, but economically, politically,
Forward
socially,
money,
so
yeah.
much change. And with executive pay, we keep talking about it. It's been talked about for 20, 30 years, and nothing really changes. There are lots of CEOs that are responsible. And boards that are responsible, that develop pay packages that make sense. They're reasonable. They deliver returns to their shareholders. And there are places where uh, packages are not so reasonable. And there are stories behind those. And
Yeah, and Alan, your topic is very timely because from what I was reading, it looks like this problem is worsening. The employee to CEO ratio that you mentioned, which is now in the 200, wasn't the case, 30 years ago or late 90s even. It was still, much better. And I think with every passing year, and definitely every passing decade, it is getting substantially worse. So, yes,
is.
that makes a lot of sense. Alan, what would you say or ask HR leaders to do to set up successful conversations in the boardroom or board meeting? I know the topics are often related to human capital strategies, compensation, equity burn. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is, one of the ways that I like to think about it is connecting my reality with their reality. So in a way, it's almost like a type of professional empathy. You almost, you really got to know your audience. And when I go into a compensation committee meeting, I need to anticipate questions, for example. And I'm usually trying to anticipate questions far beneath where they're likely to ask.
I see.
That gives me confidence to walk into the committee and not feel like, oh gosh, this is a nerve-wracking situation, because I'm well prepared. And you also have to speak not the language of HR, but the
Yes.
language of business.
Financials.
And
Yes.
that's usually going to be data.
Yes.
And this is where compensation and analytics within HR has kind of led the way for connecting. This might be a personal opinion, but connecting HR even more to the business. You know, 30 years ago, HR executives were talking about getting a seat at the table.
Yes.
Well, HR leaders are clearly at the table now, and you'll
Right.
find some HR leaders actually are named executives in the proxy.
Right.
It means that they're one of the top 5 highest paid executives in the company.
Yes.
So the role of the HR leader has it's come to it's the pinnacle of where people dreamed that it would be 30 years ago. But that's the credibility thing. I mean, you're essentially going into these committees and you're building relationship with the members because you're going to come back every quarter
Right,
and present materials.
right,
Um, they need to have confidence in the materials that you're presenting. It needs to be relevant information connected to the business. The data has to be spot on. We say kind of in the executive compensation space that if there's a data error that becomes apparent in the meeting, it feels like a bullet whizzing by your head because it's a
correct,
threat to your credibility.
correct.
So got to just the quality review of materials super important. And you just have to know your material and be comfortable talking about it, presenting it, and having a conversation about it.
That's amazing, Alan. Thank you. This was super insightful.
Sure.
Just as our last question, for any young HR professionals considering a career in compensation, what tips would you have for them? Would you say stay away? Would you say welcome? Just talk to us about that.
No, I definitely wouldn't say stay away. I mean, it's been such a rewarding career for me. It's multidisciplinary.
Yes, I
So
agree.
it's very challenging, very fulfilling because it touches on aspects of a lot of other things. There's legal aspects, there's financial aspects. There are people, personalities and behaviors and things like that. Building an incentive plan is all about connecting the financials
With
with the
behavior.
behaviors and the thoughts and actions of people inside a company. So I would absolutely recommend it. But it's funny that most of the people that you find in compensation, they kind of fell into it accidentally somehow,
Yes.
because it's not something that you find that you study in a typical, business program or as an undergraduate, certainly. But I'd say if you're thinking about a career in compensation, critical thing, there's two big things. Your quantitative skills.
Right.
You got to nail them. They've got to be the highest,
Yes.
super strong. And then you need to be able to talk about the data. Uh,
Yes.
you know,
That's the part where is more of a learning curve for
need
most.
to be able to sort of build the narrative around the data because the data itself is not important. It's how it's going to be used in the decision making, the relevance to the business context. And that's the way that HR got in the door. And that's how they got the seat at the table was by bringing relevant data to the business. And it made people, say, "Whoa, well, I didn't even realize this. Wow." So those are the two big skills that you've got to have.
This is amazing, Alan. I definitely learned a lot from this conversation. I'm so grateful to you for taking the time.